What's up, guys? Dan Can React here. Today we're reacting to Who Are They? Ruthless Aggression's Era Forgotten Wrestlers by Wrestle with Andy. Now, I know some of the wrestlers, like Luther Reigns. Before Roman Reigns, it was Luther Reigns. He was okay, but I know he was forgotten over time. The Basham Brothers, I don't know if y'all remember them. Orlando Jordan, Maven, Raven, Eugene, Mr. Kennedy, and all of them. But I know a lot of them were forgotten, and I know some of them are even still wrestling today, or they're not. They're retired from wrestling years ago, or they're just doing other stuff now, like music, or just having regular normal jobs. But where are they now? Hopefully in this video it'll talk about it. If they don't, then hope they're doing okay with their lives and they're taking good care of themselves. The original video will be in the description down below. If you want to check that out after this, be sure to do that. And now let's get into this video and see what's up.
Ruthless Aggression era was one of the most beloved times in WWE history, with this being when a lot of big names rose to the forefront of the company. Names such as John Cena, Brock Lesnar, Batista, and Randy Orton. That said, for every star who was born back then, there were many others who failed to get out of the starting blocks, and those performers have often gone forgotten by most fans as a result. But who are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, and where better to start than with Luther Reigns.
Yeah, him.
Yes, in the world of WWE, before there was Roman Reigns, there was his far less famous namesake, Luther. Why was Luther Reigns never a big deal on the level of the Tribal Chief? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, perhaps too many to list here, so maybe the best thing to do would be to tell you the story of his time in the WWE and let you decide for yourself. It all began in April of 2003. That was when Matthew Weiss first began appearing on SmackDown under the guise of Luther Reigns, the assistant to then Blue Brand General Manager Kurt Angle.
I remember that.
And while this might have seemed like a good way to get a new talent established, putting him with one of the top stars the brand had, in the end, Reigns' period spent under the learning tree of the Olympic hero did little to help him. Why was this? Well, because Luther Reigns was no Kurt Angle. Hell, he wasn't Charlie Haas either, if we're being honest. And so, despite him picking up a number of wins as time went on, and despite him at one point finding a tag team partner in Mark Jindrak, he never quite got over with fans whenever he came out through the curtain. Not that this stopped WWE from trying to get him over, though. The only problem was that whatever Vince McMahon saw in the big man, live audiences obviously weren't seeing the same thing. It didn't matter if he was being given big matches against performers such as Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and The Undertaker, or whether he was getting into tests of strength with The Big Show. After a certain point, it became all too clear that the original Reigns experiment just wasn't working. So that was why, after spending most of 2005 being relegated to Velocity, the New York native must have realized the axe was about to fall over his head. And because of this, he chose the proactive route by negotiating for his own release in May of that year. What would he do after that? Well, while he would still make the occasional one-off appearance at indie wrestling shows, Luther Reigns' life would now mostly revolve around interests outside of the ring, such as working security for bands like Saliva and Alter Bridge. And it seems that he isn't the only forgotten Ruthless Aggression era star whose time in the ring all but came to an end after he left WWE, as the exact same thing could be said about our next subject, Casey James. Don't remember Casey James? That's understandable, as there wasn't a huge amount to remember here, unfortunately. No, despite working for Vince McMahon for 3 years between 2006 and 2008, there were really no moments of note which happened as a result of Kurt Sellers being inside of a WWE ring. Sure, some might argue the tag team which first introduced him to fans, the one which saw him and Idol Stevens be managed down to the ring by their teacher, Michelle McCool, was a moment which deserves mentioning. Yes, it's true that they did beat WWE Tag Team Champions Paul London and Brian Kendrick at one point. But again, tag team wrestling in the Ruthless Aggression era WWE was never treated as a big deal. And fans still didn't show much interest when, upon the collapse of the Teacher's Pets in early 2007, Casey James was left with nothing to do other than to return to Ohio Valley Wrestling for a while, where he milled around, waiting for the call which would take him back up to the main roster. Sadly, though, even once this call came, it meant that the Illinois native would be called up to WWECW and not the main roster.
Dang.
And it wasn't even as if he was treated like a player there. Rather, he was pretty much just used as a jobber who could be brought in whenever required so as to lose to bigger names like CM Punk or Shelton Benjamin. And after this, James was eventually cut from his contract in August of 2008. And with his experience with WWE completely burning him on the industry by this point, he'd pretty much disappear entirely afterwards. But not every forgotten star of the Ruthless Aggression era disappeared from the public eye after getting fired by the Fed. No, some continued to work in other places for a while yet. And if you need an example of this in action, you only have to look to our next subject, Gunner Scott.
Yeah,
That's right, Scott had a run on SmackDown during 2006. However, despite having all the physical attributes Vince McMahon was looking for in a wrestler back then, the Tulsa native's time on the main roster lasted for all of 3 months between April and June of that year. Why was it such a short run? Well, that's probably because, despite being a big, muscular guy, Brent Albright, the man behind the gimmick, was still green in the ring.
Dang.
And so it didn't matter if he was given a big win over Booker T during his debut match. Hell, it didn't even matter if he beat Booker for a second time during their tag team rematch a few weeks later.
He did?
No, regardless of how many times he pinned the 5-time WCW champion, it was clear for all to see that he just wasn't ready for the big time yet. And it wasn't as if Gunner Scott got much opportunity to improve on SmackDown, as before he could really get a chance to grab a foothold, he'd be taken off the show and sent right back down to Ohio Valley Wrestling again, WWE's developmental league at the time. And it was there that his time with WWE would come to an end, as before he could ever make his main roster return, he'd be released from his contract in October of 2006.
Dang.
What did he do after that? Well, rather than quitting entirely, Scott chose to rebuild himself in places such as Ring of Honor and the National Wrestling Alliance, with it being in the latter that he briefly became NWA World Champion after defeating current SmackDown General Manager Adam Pearce for the honor.
Hey, it's Adam
and this
Pearce.
means even if his time in WWE during the Ruthless Aggression era was a wash, at least he can always say he made something of himself elsewhere. But let's move away from the men for a moment, because it's not just them who made up the roster of forgettable stars of 2000's WWE. No, there were plenty of women who fit that bill too, and one of the most notable of these was our next subject, Joy Giovanni.
Yeah,
now, if you remember Joy Giovanni for any reason, then it's likely because in 2004 she took part in that year's Diva Search competition. And while she wouldn't win there, she obviously impressed the right people enough because after it was over, she'd be offered a contract anyway. Sadly though, being a good bikini model didn't necessarily mean you were going to be good on a wrestling show. And the limitations the Boston native had in this area quickly became apparent when, upon debuting on the November 18th, 2004 episode of SmackDown as a massage therapist, she failed to get over in any meaningful way. Sure, Giovanni did have her fans. However, she never seemed to stand out amongst the other women on the roster at the time that could perform in the ring as well as take part in Divas segments. Yes, the Diva Search contestant was only going to go so far, with the limits to this apparently being her feud with Amy Weber. Why do we say this was the limit?
I don't know what that
well,
is
because
either.
not many
I don't
fans could
remember.
find a reason to get excited about a feud between these two, especially when so much of it revolved around bad backstage skits on account of the fact that neither of them were actual wrestlers, and so they couldn't be expected to keep live audiences' attention in the ring.
Episode.
Even when great performers like Kurt Angle fell into the orbit of the whole thing, this did nothing to spark any kind of fan interest. Rather, all it did was bring the Olympic hero down rather than rise Joy Giovanni up. And so it was then that wrestling was not going to be a long-term thing for the woman from Boston. No, it was only going to be a brief dalliance, one which ultimately came to an end when she was cut from her contract in July of 2005.
Dang.
Yes, it's true that Joy Giovanni did make a brief return at WrestleMania 25 as part of the Miss WrestleMania 25 Diva Battle Royal, but the less said about that, the better. No, instead, let's move over to our next subject. Who are we talking about here? Why, Sylvester Terkay, of course. That's right, we're really getting into the weeds of obscure Ruthless Aggression characters now, because even for those who were regular watchers at the time, this is a name which might be hard to place. And the reason for that is not just because Terkay did so little during his time in WWE, but because his time there was just so short in general, blink and you'll miss it almost.
Dang.
Sure, he was under WWE contract as early as the first half of 2006, as that was when he started training down in Ohio Valley Wrestling. But in terms of being seen on TV, this didn't start until July of that year, the point he debuted on SmackDown as an MMA-style heavy to Elijah Burke. How did this gimmick go for him? Not great. No, whenever the Pennsylvania native was tasked with taking on the managerial role, it didn't do much to make him stand out. And whenever he got in the ring himself to challenge the likes of whatever jobber of the week was thrown his way, he didn't exactly shine in a way that made you think you were watching a future WrestleMania main eventer at work. Even when the pair took part in tag team action together under their special team name of the Knockout Tapout Connection, it did little to excite fans. But then that was probably partially because by this point, they were locked away on the WWE CW brand. Yes, the truth was, there was little which could be done to turn Sylvester Terkai's fortunes around by the time 2006 came to an end. And so that was why in January of 2007, when WWE were looking for more people to cut from their contracts, his name was close to the top of the list.
So he's a budget.
That's right, this would be the end of the big man's time in WWE, but thankfully for him, it wouldn't be the end of his time in combat sports, because after spending a brief subsequent period in Japan wrestling for both the Inoki Genome Federation and Pro Wrestling 01, Terkai would start out a whole second career as a kickboxer and MMA fighter for K1. Because he's lucky he had those shoot skills he could apply elsewhere then. It's just a shame the same shoot skills could not be found in our next subject when he parted ways with WWE following a pretty woeful Ruthless Aggression era run. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Colin Delaney? Not that Colin Delaney was untalented, of course. No, well, he might not have been an adept cage fighter, he was a pretty decent journeyman pro wrestler. And that's why it's such a shame his time in WWE between 2007 and 2008 was so short-lived. But then, it wasn't as if he was ever given much of a chance to succeed while wrestling there, as perhaps due to his relatively short stature, whenever he was brought in for an appearance on either SmackDown or the WWE CW brand, it was usually as a jobber to a much more focused upon star. That's right, rather than get any opportunity to shine and show what he could do in the ring, Delaney was more often than not just a warm body, one which could be quickly dispatched of by performers such as Shelton Benjamin, Matt Hardy, and Big Daddy V. In fact, at one point, he was considered so much of a low priority, he wasn't even given a tag team partner during a match against The Miz and John Morrison. So at a certain point then, it became make or break for the Rochester native, with this becoming clear when WWE CW General Manager Armando Estrada told him he would have to pick up a win soon if he wanted an ECW contract. And with this pushing him forward, Delaney was eventually able to get this win in May of 2006, and as a result, a permanent spot on the roster. Or at least he was able to get a permanent spot on the roster for a while, as after spending the next 2 years pretty much being relegated to the level of jobber again, he'd be cut from his contract in August of 2008, with this marking the last time he'd be seen in the WWE during this era. But at least Colin Delaney had a somewhat notable run on TV before his time with WWE ended, the same of which cannot be said for our next subject, Chrissy Vane. No, when it came to Chrissy Vane, her time on the main roster was another which was so short-lived, it may as well have not happened at all. But it did happen, and it happened during the Ruthless Aggression era. More specifically, it happened in the autumn of 2007. That was the point when, following a year and a half spent in Deep South Wrestling, and then another few months after that spent in Florida Championship Wrestling, the Greensboro native was finally given the call up to SmackDown, where she was quickly cast as the villain in a feud with Tori Wilson.
Oh yeah.
Unfortunately though, the feud between Chrissy Vane and Tori Wilson never really went anywhere after the initial attack by the heel, as before it could, the rookie would be out of the door quick. Why was this? Well, because after appearing on the subsequent episode of SmackDown where her character was seen negotiating with then Blue Brand General Manager Vicky Guerrero, Vane would leave WWE alongside her real-life boyfriend Ryan O'Reilly as a result of family issues. So because of that, there would be no further involvement from her in the storyline going forward, and barely any involvement from her in the larger wrestling world either, as, aside from a few appearances on the independent circuit, one of which actually saw her wrestle Chris Statlander in 2019, she'd be done with the industry altogether. Yes, back then, when there were far fewer options to make money in wrestling if you weren't working for the only big game in town, it was all too easy for a performer to disappear entirely after their time with WWE came to an end. And this wasn't just the case for solo acts either. No, it was often the case for tag teams too, such as can be found in what happened with the Highlanders.
I think I remember.
Who were the Highlanders? Well, if the name didn't give it away, they were two Scottish wrestlers named Robbie and Rory McAllister, who performed in WWE between 2006 and 2008 as part of the Raw Tag Team division. But while they may have worn kilts, they were less current-day Drew McIntyre in terms of success and more 3MB-era Drew McIntyre in terms of failure. Of course, being a tag team during 2000's WWE was always going to be an albatross around their neck, though. But then it wasn't like they did themselves any favor with their pretty mid-matches against the likes of the Spirit Squad or Lance Cade and Trevor Murdoch either. No, all these performances managed to do was solidify the fact that on the Red brand during the middle of the decade, they were way behind in importance when compared to the real stars like John Cena, Shawn Michaels, and Triple H. Even the tag team titles, a set of belts which every team, makeshift or otherwise, seemed to get a shot with back then, remained out of reach for the boys from Scotland, with this only further cementing their status to WWE fans as lower card acts. And so, come 2007, they'd barely be making appearances on Raw at all. And come 2008, they'd have fallen as far as to have started making dates for the WWE CW brand, with this representing the low point of a run which has since mostly gone forgotten at time. In fact, the most memorable thing they did during their time in WWE at all didn't even happen on a WWE show.
Dang.
No, the thing most people think of now when they think of the Highlanders is the fact that Robbie McAllister got the team fired when he was spotted in the audience at a TNA show in 2008. But then, as Robbie has since argued, this was something he was secretly hoping would happen by then, as he was so unhappy with his time in WWE, he was looking to get fired in many ways. And the Highlanders weren't the only tag team who were having a bad time in Ruthless Aggression era WWE, as the same thing could be said about our next subject, the Heartthrobs.
Yeah, I don't
That's
know
right, the Heartthrobs, the possible answer to the question, who was the most forgettable double act on mid-2000s Raw? And the reason they were so forgettable was because in 2004 and 2005, no one was interested in watching this gimmick. What was this gimmick? Well, the pair played the characters of Antonio and Romeo, two men who danced their way to the ring every week to bad 90s club house music. Yes, this is exactly what the duo were given to work with upon debuting with the Red brand in April of the former year. So almost immediately, they'd find themselves dead in the water as the reactions they got whenever they came out were ice cold. But regardless of the absolute death knell that was their gimmick, the two men involved tried their best to power through it anyway. The only problem was, so bad was it, we could have been talking about The Rock and Stone Cold here, and it would still be a challenge to make fans care for a tag team called the Heartthrobs during the Ruthless Aggression era of WWE. Needless to say then, as time went on and the stock of Antonio and Romeo continued to freefall, they found that even getting a spot on Raw was a difficult task. Yes, by the time 2006 came around, instead of Monday nights being their permanent home, they were far more likely to be found plying their craft on an episode of Heat against opponents such as Val Venus, Viscera, or the Hurricane.
Ooh.
Even the introduction of a kiss cam gimmick in which they tried to get ladies in the audience to make out with them couldn't save things here.
Nope.
And so it was that in February of the same year, both men would be released from their contracts, never to be seen in WWE again thereafter. But let's move away from tag team wrestling for now and back over to the singles division again, as it's there we find our next subject, someone who also failed to make any kind of significant impact in WWE when they joined the roster there during the Ruthless Aggression era, Johnny Parisi.
Yeah, I don't know who that is.
And what makes this one all the worse is that it wasn't even Parisi's first go-around in the promotion. No, years prior to that, in 1995, the Niagara Falls native would make a few appearances on early episodes of Raw to play the role of jobber to the likes of Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Shane Douglas, and Marty Jannetty. Obviously then, given the enhancement talent nature of the task he was being asked to do, Joe Dorgan, the man behind the character, didn't amount to much here. Not that this would be his only shot in WWE though, because years later, after he'd undergone an entire career as a journeyman performer, showing up in places such as WCW, ECW, and TNA, Dorgan would make his return to the Fed on July 31st, 2005, on an episode of Sunday Night Heat, with him now working under the gimmick of Johnny Parisi. What happened following this? Well, not a lot, unfortunately, because despite being a mainstay of Heat for a couple of months after that, Parisi never really amounted to much else. No, here was a case of someone never even getting a single solitary moment on either Raw or SmackDown during the mid-2000s, And because of that, then, it's hard to remember that he was there at all if you weren't one of the very few people watching WWE's C shows at the time.
I mean, yeah,
Still, at least this run wouldn't represent the end for him, because afterwards, he'd continue on as a stalwart of the indies for over a decade.
Different.
And in 2019, he'd even get a shot at appearing on television again when he returned to the Impact Zone, and there played the role of Johnny Swinger for a while. So it just goes to show, even if you were a wrestler who didn't make it big in WWE during the Ruthless Aggression era, you could still have a nice career for yourself elsewhere.
Alright, well, that was the video. If you want me to react to any other videos, let me know in the comments down below. And I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.